Hi. These are two of the 4 new Mark III LAUNCHKEY MIDI and DAW controllers from Novation. They're based around an arpeggiator that can offer up generative mutations to your patterns, built-in scale and custom chord pads, the arpeggiator and chords can work without a computer and interface with synths directly over MIDI. And these keyboards also have a tight integration with Ableton Live, including full control over device parameters. In this video, I'll take a look at what these controllers can do, the differences between the 4 versions of these keyboards, namely what the extra faders and buttons on the 49 and 61 key versions do, what the custom modes are. Let's get started with an overview, and since the 25 and 37 versions have a lot in common with the 49 and 61 key versions, I'll be discussing most of the features on the 37 just because it fits more nicely in the frame. We'll discuss what's different about the 49 and 61 key versions when their additional features are relevant. The action is fairly light, but solid. Feels like there's good control of velocity out of the box, and you can choose different velocity curves in the settings menu if you like. All 4 have velocity-sensitive pads. Fairly good sensitivity, obviously not as fine control as the keys. The pads are also pressure-sensitive and have polyphonic aftertouch. All 4 have physical pitch bend and mod wheels. And all 4 have a nicely visible and backlit screen with 2 lines of text for parameter control. So you always have an idea of what you're controlling. That said, the knobs aren't touch sensitive, so you need to actually turn a knob to figure out which parameter it controls. Overall, using these keyboards is fairly straightforward. Everything is either labeled on the buttons or labeled as a shift function next to the keys or above and below the pads and below the faders over here. In terms of connectivity, the entire series has 3 connectors: USB for MIDI and power, 5-pin MIDI to work directly with standalone hardware instruments without a computer, and a sustain pedal input. As is typical for the LAUNCHKEY series, they come with a tight integration with Ableton Live, as well as Huey-based capabilities for other DAWs. Let's talk about brains versus brawns when it comes to MIDI keyboards, meaning what they can do on their own without a computer. Traditionally, MIDI keyboards have only sent out note on-off information and parameters through the knobs or faders. As these and other keyboards evolve, we're starting to see more smarts in the keyboards themselves, like arpeggiators, sequencers, chords, and so on. Where these keyboards start to make things interesting in terms of brain power is that they also have a built-in arpeggiator with a few nifty generative features, which means you can use them to send arpeggiated patterns directly to a synth without a computer in between. All of the keyboards in this series also have a few interesting chord options, but they don't have a sequencer like their bigger brother, the SL Mark III, or other keyboards with built-in sequencers. Let's dive into the details. I'll start with the arpeggiator. Like I mentioned, it's built in, meaning that it can send notes to a computer, but also to a standalone synth. The arpeggiator controls are written above the keys and above these 5 knobs. Let's take a listen to the arpeggiator with a simple piano sound. You can either choose to latch it or not, obviously with shift. The arpeggiator parameters are written across the panel. Let's just take a quick listen to a few of them. Direction is pretty obvious, or arpeggiator type. Rate is the relative rate in multiples relative to the internal tempo. And there are triplet options to the rate as well. I think I missed the chord option if you don't want the arpeggiator to be an arpeggiator. There's also mutate, we'll get to that in a bit. And then there are a few octave options, up to 4 octaves. So this is pretty much standard par for the course arpeggiator stuff. Rhythm is a fun one. It'll insert either a single rest or 2 rests, or randomly insert rests. That's a bit of a drunk option. And then there's Deviate, which we'll get to in the generative features in a bit. And there are 5 more parameters you can control with knobs on top. If you hold the ARP button, it'll give you access to these parameters without requiring you to hold Shift. Swing is, again, what you'd expect. Either positive or negative swing. And there's gate length, how long the notes are held. And then there's Mutate, which will work if we activate it as an arpeggiator type. Mutate gradually adds changes to notes in your pattern. The nice thing about how Mutate works is that it only throws the randomization dice as long as you turn the knob. Once you stop, the randomness will stop and you get to keep whatever pattern was playing at the time. It starts out by swapping out notes for notes an octave above or below, and then gradually introduces other intervals, fifths and fourths, until finally just swapping out your notes for completely random ones. You can use the built-in scale feature to tame this madness a little bit, and you can try out different scales. This, I think, is what's nice about generative processes or algorithms. They throw at you a few ideas. You don't need to accept all of them, you can always move on. The nice thing about this particular implementation is that if you find something you like, you can just stop turning the Mutate button. And there's more madness to be had with Deviate, which does what Mutate does, but to rests. Again, you turn the knob, it'll generate a pattern, and then you can roll the dice again by turning the knob again, increasing the craziness if you want. And that is the Arpeggiator. We had a little glimpse into scales before. They can lock the keyboard into any one of 8 different scales. Minor pentatonic in this case, shift scale lets you change the scale to any one of these 8 options. From a generative perspective, the nice thing about these scales is that the arpeggiator is subject to them. So we talked about the arpeggiator as a standalone feature regardless of a computer. We talked about scales also built into the keyboard. You don't need a computer for that. Next up are scale chords and user chords. So once you've selected a scale, let's go for C major, for example. If you hit Shift and scale chords, the pads let you launch chords in the scale. There are 4 rows of pads. You see 2 at a time. You see this button here. If you press it, you'll move down to the 2 other rows, the 2 middle rows, or the 2 top rows. The first row gives you simple triads with inversions, which is cool. Then you've got sevenths, also with inversions, ninths for the 3rd row, and then 6, 9 chords on the bottom row. And you can transpose the chords up and down using Shift and these arrows. Another nice touch is that you can use the settings to assign these chords to a different channel. So the keys go out to one channel, chords go out to another one, and of course drums do as well. Next up are the user chords. These are 16 programmable chords. You've got 16 slots. You delete a slot by doing this, and then program a new one by holding the pad and punching in your chord. And you can add up to 6 notes per chord. The final chord option baked into the keyboard is fixed chords. You hold the fixed chord button, program in a chord interval, let's say, and then just play that up and down the keyboard. Okay, let's talk about the custom modes. These are modes where you can customize which MIDI commands get sent out by the pots, the pads, and the faders and these buttons. These are extremely useful if you want to control a hardware synth that expects to receive specific MIDI CC messages or notes, or for program change commands, or just to send out custom notes. You can't customize these templates using the hardware itself. You'll need access to a computer with either a browser like Chrome, Novation's site, or Novation's components software, but you can store 4 sets of templates on board for the pots, the pads, and the faders and buttons. Once you've stored these templates, you can access them by holding Shift and pressing either buttons 1, 2, 3, or 4 here for the different pot modes, buttons 1, 2, 3, and 4 for the pad modes, for the custom pad modes, and then same thing over there, Shift and custom 1, 2, 3, or 4 for the different templates for the faders and the buttons. Anyway, you head out to the components software, you press launch key, then you can either import the custom modes into the software or just head on out and create a new custom mode for the pots, the pads, or the faders and buttons. So let's say I wanted to create a custom template for the pots and change, say, this pot to control CC30. You could also name the pots if you wanted. Choose minimum and maximum values, pickup mode, and then choose whether this pot broadcasts MIDI commands on the global channel or on a specific channel, regardless of the global channel. Then hit send to launch key. Let's choose custom mode 4. Then if I go into here, choose pot mode 4, turn this knob, it'll be CC30. You can't currently see the name I gave that pot, but I'm told that feature is coming in a future firmware update. Same goes for customizing the pads. Pads have a single on color, which is the color they'll light up with once you press them, but you can have them light up in whatever colors of the rainbow you choose. Not to mention change what they actually do, so they can send CC messages for when they're on or off, and they can also send notes and also program changes. Again, you can name them, which won't be shown currently, but hopefully soon. Then send them to the launch key. Let's go ahead and send it as mode 3, why not? Then I go into here, choose pad mode 3, and it's here. I didn't see the option to send pressure as CCs here. Hopefully that's added as well. And then finally, you can also change the faders and buttons on the 49 and 61 key launch keys. Same deal here. These basically behave like pots. CC number, minimum, maximum, and unless I missed something, the buttons behave just like the pads. Again, control change, notes, or program changes. If we take a look at program change, you can see basic program change functionality. I didn't see any MSB/LSB options or NPRNs here, perhaps again in a future update. Okay, so that's everything you need to know about the launch keys as generic MIDI controllers, whether controlling hardware or software instruments. Let's take a quick look at the integration with Ableton Live. All the launch keys have a transport control section with play, stop, session record, and a loop toggle, and then capture MIDI, quantize, a metronome, and undo. One little request for the future, it would be nice if shift undo would be a redo. You select the active track, going left and right using these arrows. If you've got the 49 key version, you can also select the active track by pressing select and picking the track. Colors light up pretty nicely as well. In session mode, this 8x2 grid is a view into your bigger session grid. You move up and down using these arrow keys and left and right like this as well. So your view of the session changes like that. You can very easily launch clips or launch entire scenes using this button. And of course, transport works as well. If you like, you can give up the bottom row in favor of stop, mute, and solo controls. So let's say, for example, I'll go into this scene, and if I wanted to stop a few clips, let's say these two, I could do that, and then obviously restart them. Then I could also solo tracks, or mute any tracks that I wanted using the mute row, or go back to seeing 2 rows at a time. In terms of track controls, the 49 and 61 key versions have an advantage, like I mentioned earlier, with either track selection here or the ability to arm tracks directly using these buttons. The pots or knobs have 4 functions in Ableton Live: either access device parameters, set track volumes, pans, and sends. You access these parameters by holding Shift and then choosing device, volume, pan, pot mode, or sends. It controls sends A and B by tapping this as a toggle. Let's start by looking at device controls. A pretty handy function here is device lock. So I've locked these pots to control this synth device regardless of which track I'm on. If you unlock them, then you'll be controlling devices in the active track. So if I wanted to say again, go into my synth track. You can see I've got two devices here. You select devices by pressing device select, obviously, then using the up and down arrow keys, I can control either realm or my bass. Here I've got just 8 macros. For realm, there are a few pages or banks of parameters which you can access by tapping these 3 pads. If there were fewer parameters, you'd see fewer pads here. Each pad represents a bank of 8 parameters. The knobs work in pickup mode. This, for example, is the pre-delay. So if I wanted to change, unfortunately you can't see what a parameter is before you press it. Let's say that I wanted to edit the low cut. I'd have to pick it up first, and only then could I change that parameter. Let's say if you go to a different bank, area, mode control, diffusion, size, decay, and so nice control over all the parameters. Let's go to the last bank, freeze. So this is an on-off toggle. Move it here. I've got a frozen reverb, which I could unfreeze. So that's how you control plugin or device parameters. If I wanted to lock this in, just hit lock again. Regardless of where I go, which track I go, I could always freeze my sound using this control, which is obviously very convenient. So that's how you control device parameters. Other pot modes are volume, pretty self-explanatory. You control the level for the tracks that you view in your little view into the grid. There's pickup here, so you'll only control parameters if you pick up their value and then change them. And there's the parameter information here, of course. Next up is panning, also straightforward. Pan left and right for the tracks that are visible. Again, with pickup, so you need to find the parameter and only then can you change it. And then sends, only 2 sends, unfortunately. Again, pick up the parameter and change it on a per track basis, and then send B, same thing. Pick up, change. The linear faders or sliders work just like the pots, only you don't have control over panning. Instead, you've got control over send A and send B separately. You can't have the pots and the faders control the same parameters. So for example, here, if I'm controlling the device, I can't access that over here, but I could still choose either send A, send B, or volume. Then again, same deal here, choose the tracks that I view using the left and right arrows, and then change their parameters with pickup one by one. So that's pretty much it for controlling Ableton Live, either on the 25 or 37 key versions or the 49 or 61 key versions. Just to make sure I didn't miss anything, let's take a look at the settings menu. I mentioned selecting channels for the keys, chords, and drums. There are a few velocity options for the keys, a few options for the pads. Pad aftertouch can either be off, channel aftertouch, or polyphonic aftertouch. Aftertouch threshold, pot pickup, on or off, and MIDI clock out. Brightness, overall. Vegas mode. That's pretty much it for the settings. Another interesting option is these 3 dots. What they do is turn the pads into arrow keys on a keyboard and the enter key. So you could use this, for example, when editing parameters, moving between parameters and selecting them. And there's a nifty little trick I want to show you, which I show in my video with everything you need to know about Ableton Live in 37 minutes or less. A neat shortcut to quickly entering notes on the piano roll. If you activate these little headphones, notice that when I press keys, these little lines, you might not see them, these little lines appear right over here. Anyway, if I wanted to insert a chord on the piano roll at wherever the cursor is, all I need to do is hold that chord and then hit the right key for as long as I want that chord to be. Then I could pick another one, say this, again add that, and then add that. And there's plenty more tricks like this in my full tutorial. I'll link to that below. A quick note about the bundled software: all launch keys come with Ableton Live Lite and a few other interesting plugins to get you started, like Serato Sample, strings from Spitfire Audio, and more. Before we move on to the pros and cons, I just want to summarize the differences between the 25 and 37 key launch keys and the 49 and 61 key versions, aside from the number of keys, of course. Obviously, it's this section with the extra faders and buttons, the 9 additional faders and 9 buttons on the 49 and 61 key launch keys. These additional 9 faders and buttons are relevant both for the custom modes or templates, where you effectively get more than double the CC controls with the faders, 9 on top of 8, and you have direct access to 9 additional buttons on top of the 16 pads, though these buttons aren't velocity sensitive. Aside from the extra controls in the custom modes for hardware or software instruments, this section also gives you more control of your DAW. I've not tested other DAW integrations, but with Ableton Live, this means an extra set of faders for device volume and send controls. Also noteworthy is the 9th master volume control fader, only available on the 49 and 61 key versions, as well as the arm and select functions. Again, only available on the 49 and 61 key, though you could program custom modes on the 25 or 37 key versions to do the same functions. So you could say, for example, choose custom pad mode 4 to either arm or select different tracks. You'd need to obviously MIDI map this to your DAW, and it won't move along with the tracks, but it's something rather than nothing. Okay, let's take a look at the pros and cons. I'll start with Ableton Live. If you're looking for a controller with live integration on a budget, these are probably your best bet. There are other more pricey Ableton Live controllers with more screen real estate and other features, like Novation's own SL Mark III, Native Instruments Complete, or Push 2, but expect to pay substantially more for those compared to these. A couple of things that would have been nice to have both on the Ableton Live side and when using the custom templates, like I mentioned earlier, is some sort of preview for the pot or fader values before you actually change them. While we're at it, it would also be nice if you could make coarse adjustments, not just fine-tune adjustments, if you wanted to hit specific values very quickly. If you want to use these keyboards with an iPhone or iPad, you'll need to power them separately, other than on the newest iPad Pros, which may work. I've not tested it. On the hardware side, if you're a fan of metal enclosures, these aren't for you. Personally, I'd rather travel light, and I'm not bothered by plastic in any way. Neither the enclosure or the keys feel cheap. The action on the keys is a little light compared to more premium semi-weighted or, of course, fully weighted keys, but you get used to it very quickly, and I find these very convenient. That said, if you're looking for aftertouch, none of the keyboards in this range have it. In terms of standalone brains, all the keyboards in this series have plenty of chord modes and a fun generative arpeggiator, but no sequencer. As MIDI keyboards get smarter and more advanced, it would be nice to see basic sequencing features added here. Maybe that's what these marks are for. Who knows? Currently they're reserved for future features. Another thing I'd like to see, which I believe will be added, is that in the custom modes, you'll be able to see what the parameters are, the way you've named them in components rather than just what the CC is. You should also note that you can't edit the custom modes using the keyboards themselves, something that doesn't matter much if you're using these next to a computer because components software is very easy to use, but since these keyboards work standalone if you're on the road and want to map a new parameter, you'll need a computer nearby to make that happen. I also want to say a good word about the interface. You're probably not going to need to reference the manual. Things are very clearly laid out and labeled. In the rare case that something isn't labeled, there's something there to give you a hint at where a feature is. So for example, if I go into user chords, you use this to delete a user chord. You wouldn't know that because it's not labeled, but notice that this pad is lit up, which is sort of a hint that it has a function. So you can pretty much figure out that if you press it, it then says delete chord, and then you just delete the chords like this. Same thing, for example, if I go to scale chords, notice this pad is lit up and this pad isn't, meaning you can't go up anymore, but you can go down, and again, then you can't anymore, so it's not lit up, you can go back up. It's these little clues that make it so that you don't need to reference the manual. So that's pretty much it for the launch keys. If you want a whole bunch of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks, check out my book, available to the people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, and don't forget to ring the bell after subscribing if you don't want to miss the next one. Thanks for watching.